So welcome to today's Research Pays Off. My name is Lauren Dow. I am the Communications Coordinator for the National Road Research Alliance. I want to just give a quick reminder to have your mics muted during the presentation, and there will be an option to have your mics on during the Q&A session at the end. And any questions that you have, please put them in the chat box below, and I have asked Amlan to review those and answer those during the Q&A session. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted to the National Road Research Alliance YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find that probably by the end of the week, along with all of our other recorded sessions and all of the webinars that have taken place so far related to the 2020 Pavement Workshop. Next month, we have scheduled for August 18th a presentation on the use of the road doctor for evaluation of pavements affected by severe cracking and heaving. And that will be presented by Eob from MnDOT. This morning, I want to welcome Amlan Mukherjee. He's an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at Michigan Technological University. His research interests have primarily been in studying civil infrastructure systems through the lens of risk and life cycle analysis to improve project outcomes such as project cost, performance, and environmental impacts. He has extensive background and experience in life cycle assessment for the construction materials industries and has facilitated the development and implementation of the Environmental Product Development Program for the North American Asphalt Mixtures for the National Asphalt Pavement Association. He also serves on the Federal Highways Administration Sustainable Pavements Technical Working Group. In related work, he recently co-authored the NRRA guidelines for sustainable highway construction practices. Dr. Mukherjee also serves on the board of directors for the Green Buildings Initiative and the Green Roads Foundation. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Washington and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Michigan. And so we welcome you today, Amlan, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lauren. And good morning, everybody. This is a little odd because I don't really know who I'm speaking to, but wherever you are, I hope you've been having a good morning. So today, I'll be presenting to you some work that was done by TriSite. We have Liana Miller from TriSite, who was my co-lead on this effort, and myself in the last year or so. We completed it sometime in the middle of 2019 for Minnesota DOT. And we're looking at environmental product declarations, life cycle assessment, and how all of that integrates into potential business practices for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So before we start off, just to give you a little lay of the land of where this presentation is going, I want to start off with a little discussion of LCAs, EPDs, and PCRs. And for those of you who are familiar with this field, this is quite a bit of an alphabet soup. And there are multiple acronyms, and oftentimes for those of us in the field, we tend to use these acronyms without being very without really taking care of explaining them properly. So I was going to spend a little time starting off to really clarify and differentiate between what each of these are and how they fit into the general landscape of this area. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about using EPDs in procurement, what are some of the trends we're seeing across the country, and where things are going, and the body of knowledge that's been developed around it. And then finally, I'll finish off with, and this is actually, I'm saying finish off, but really the majority of the presentation is going to be talking about the roadmap that we developed for Minnesota DOT. And then hopefully after that, we'll still have a little bit of time, intend to have a little bit of time for a question and answer session and some feedback and discussion. So why are we having this conversation in the first place, right? And we've been working in the area of looking at environmental impacts of construction materials within the civil construction industry for a while, but really, what are the factors that are pushing us towards more sustainable procurement and the real drivers in the market right now? Well, there is two of them that are already there. One is LEED version 4, and they have within LEED, they have requirements for, they're incentivizing the adoption of EPDs, right? And so there are points given, which means this, and of course, LEED version 4, LEED, the system itself, as well as the Green Globes, these grading systems, they primarily cater to the buildings industry, but nonetheless, that is definitely a driver for construction materials in general. Concrete, for example, while we use them in pavements and transportation, they're also have a big, major market share within the buildings industry as well. That is definitely one of the drivers. Another driver is that there's been some recent legislation in California which requires EPDs for a specific list of materials which at the time of construction. So this is not pre-bid, this is post-bid. And so we'll be coming back to discussing a little bit about this particular act and what the implications are. But generally speaking, we're clearly at a point where there is a push towards using the environmental impact information in different formats, but primarily life cycle assessment based outcomes through procurement, and as well as to incentivizing them in design and construction. So this is the primary driver. So this is before we start off. And again, as I said, I'm going to launch off into a little bit of discussion of where all this jargon comes from, what it means, and why it's important. But generally speaking, what's the major driver right now? This is why we're doing what we're doing. So, and on that note, I'll be coming back to each of those factors later on in the conversation. But right now, let's just quickly do a quick review of fundamentals of LCA, PCRs, and EPDs. And again, as I said, these are these acronyms, you'll find them flying around a conversation quite often. So it's just a quick understanding of what each of these mean and what they stand for, right? So what is an LCA? A life cycle assessment, right? So it assesses the environmental impacts of a product or system, a product or processes through multiple phases of its lifetime. So really the key word out here is life cycle, and then we assess that and look at environmental impacts, potential environmental impacts in certain cases. And so what are the life cycle phases? Of course, generally speaking, you have manufacturing, transportation, use, reuse. Then you have transportation, because at any point of time, if you're using or reusing a material after its first use, it still has to be transported from point A to point B. And all of this continues. And then there is, of course, material extraction, disposal, recycling, the entire life cycle of the product or the process itself, right? So for construction materials, for example, we start off with where is the material being extracted from, where it is being, after which it gets transported to a plant where it gets further produced or manufactured, after which we get into construction phase where it gets placed, and after construction there is potential reuse. For example, recycled materials, which then again get transported. Maybe some more processing goes into it, after which it gets again placed, and so on and so forth, till we have end of life. And sometimes end of life of a product could be it goes into landfilling or some other waste processing sector. But generally speaking, what we do is in life cycle assessment is develop an accounting method, really, which is to understand what are the environmental impacts of that particular a set of materials that go into a product or a particular process, and what are the environmental impacts incurred. So sometimes we know what they are as incurred at after production, or what the potential environmental impacts might be as we go through the different use stages of that particular product or process. So of course this leads to the question, well, how are we expressing this? And as we all know, in science and engineering, our units are very important because that helps us understand how we are expressing a particular metric. So a functional unit is what we use in life cycle assessment as a basic reference for looking at the impact, but also comparing the impact to the functionality. So expressing the impact in terms of the functionality of an item. Because ultimately, when we're looking at these environmental impacts and we're trying to come up with alternatives which have lower environmental impacts, we need to be able to not just pick an alternative that has a lower impact, but we should be able to compare equal functionality and then look for the lower impact, right? So because otherwise it's not a fair or an appropriate comparison, right? So, for example, in the case of light bulbs, well, if you look at lumen hours, so how many hours would a light bulb last, and how many lumens would you get from it? So then lumen hours becomes a functional unit because it tells you the function as well as the lifetime, and then if that's the case, then you realize that maybe for one particular alternative, for one particular light bulb design, you have to compare 3 or 4 of another different light bulb design, right? Because that's where you have the equivalent functionality, right? Same thing with vehicles, passenger miles traveled. Well, if you look at a bus, how many passengers are there on a bus versus if you have single occupancy vehicles? Well, so again, the passenger miles, the comparison has to be set appropriately in terms of the functional units, right? And then, of course, the coffee cup. You know, if you have 3 different types of coffee delivery systems, the paper mug, the styrofoam, and just your regular mug, ceramic mug. Well, then how many, how warm does your coffee stay for how long, and then also how many uses do you get out of it? So this is where the functional unit comes in. So for in our in the transportation field, pavements particularly, we have we primarily tend to use the lane mile as a functional unit to understand the environmental impacts of typically the construction materials that go into a lane mile of pavement, right? So then we say, well, what impacts are we talking about in life cycle assessment, right? So out here, we have a table on this slide. So you're generally speaking in terms of energy use, resource use, emissions, toxicity, water and waste, right? So water, of course, is the easy one to understand. Fresh water use, where is the water coming from? How much of fresh water is being used? Waste, are we producing hazardous and or non-hazardous wastes? Energy use is a very simple and important one to understand because and often to communicate because, well, we ultimately want more energy efficient processes, and ideally we should be using, well, ideally we want to use more renewable energies, and so shifting the focus from non-renewable energies to renewable energies, recognizing, of course, that in some cases fossil fuels, which are typically non-renewable, may often be the more efficient energy to use. So looking at energy use and energy efficiency generally is useful. Again, energy efficiency reminds us about like how much work are we getting done given the amount of energy we are using. Same thing with resource use. How much resources are we using, and how much bang for our buck are we getting out of that resource use, so to say. Different categories of emissions. So the climate change, what we refer to as global warming potential. So this is looking at greenhouse gas emissions that are a driver of anthropogenic climate change. And so these are usually expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And so, which is to say, for the amount of emissions of specific greenhouse gases, how can we express them as equivalents of carbon dioxide, right? So one unit of carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1, and then everything else is measured with respect to that. So, for example, methane is 24 times has a 24 times higher potential for global warming than carbon dioxide does, and so on. Similarly, we can express emissions in terms of the impact on ozone layer depletion, acidification, as well as eutrophication in terms of nitrogen oxides. So we look at nitrogen oxide equivalents, sulfur oxide equivalents, and carbon oxide equivalents. And these are metrics that become useful when making decisions and understanding what we want to prioritize in terms of the impact on the environment. Of course, I'm not a toxicologist, so I'm not very confident about talking about the toxicity aspects. And but there are various models that are still being developed and are being upgraded from time to time within the life cycle assessment world that helps us understand the impact on human toxicity, different carcinogenic impacts, and so on. So primarily, though, within the transportation industry, the conversation that we've been having tends to focus on global warming potential, energy use, resource use, water, and what kind of waste is being produced. Well, then that brings us to the next term, which is what are our product category rules? Now, of course, as I mentioned, if you're doing a life cycle assessment across all these different life cycle stages, the question could very well arise. Well, what are you counting? If this is an accounting system, what are you accounting for and what are you not accounting for, right? And so this results in, this has resulted in the process of developing product category rules. So for a given product, establishing a consensus-driven between stakeholders set of rules that helps us address what would go into what we refer to as the system boundaries of that life cycle assessment, right? And so these product category rules they're governed by various ISO and European EN, which is the European version of standards, the ISO and EN standards. And so typically at this point, most of our PCRs have moved to an ISO 21930 or EN 15804 set of standards. And so what the idea is that we look at a particular product category and set up a set of rules that helps us standardize the process of developing life cycle assessments for that product category, right? So for example, concrete mixtures are a product category. Asphalt mixtures are a product category. Asphalt binder is a product category. Now, of course, the rules for asphalt binder affects the rules for the development of for the asphalt mixture product category, because that's a constituent material. Same thing with aggregate. Aggregate is a constituent material for concrete as well as asphalt. So for each of these products, we have these product category rules which help us establish what the environmental impacts are, what the life cycle assessment protocols, system boundaries, functional units, what they all are for different sets of life cycle stages. So for example, at this point, most of our product category rules, our PCRs, cater to cradle to gate scope for the life cycle stages. That is, we look at all the impacts from extraction, transportation, manufacturing, to the point at which the product is given, the product is manufactured, produced, and is ready to be used in construction. There has been some conversation about including construction LCAs as well, but they're not part of the current product category rules. And so, of course, now I'll come back to how use phase is tying into all of this, but right now we're not looking at including use phase impacts or potential use phase impacts into our PCRs. Once we have a PCR, once we have set the rules, we can go ahead and develop what we refer to as an environmental product declaration, an EPD, right? And so this is, I'll be referring to EPDs quite often through the presentation today. And really what the EPD has helped us do is create a communication instrument, a standardized communication instrument that by which we can communicate the outcomes for a life cycle assessment based on a set of product category rules for a given product, right? And so again, these are also governed by various ISO standards, ISO 14025 being the primary one. And so we refer to them as a type 3 environmental impact report. There is type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is Energy Star, and so a lot of you may be familiar with Energy Star. Those tend to be more voluntary-based reporting systems, whereas type 3, this is a fairly strictly reviewed with multiple third-party reviews and controls in place, right? So there is a fair amount of transparency and a lot more accountability within the EPD system. And so really what has happened is, if you look at the cradle to gate scope, right, EPDs for a cradle to gate scope have really provided us the opportunity to do what we call B2B or business to business reporting, right? So if I'm a producer if I'm an asphalt producer, asphalt mixture producer, for me, if I'm creating an EPD for my mixture, I'm really giving you a declaration of the environmental impacts of that particular mixture. And let's say you're a contractor who's going to be building the pavement, from the cradle to the point at which I'm passing the mixture onto you for paving, right? So this becomes a business to business way of reporting. And this is, and as a result, as we talk about procurement, these business-to-business instruments or at least the business-to-business instrument as EPDs have gained strength within these big procurement processes. Now, of course, you can have an EPD for a cradle to grave, which is from beginning of life to the very end of life, but at present, most of the EPDs we have are more business-to-business reporting. Again, what information is there in an EPD? What is the product? How is it manufactured? Besides, of course, all the life cycle environmental impact information, the functional / functional and or declared units. And so we will talk a little bit about declared units, because sometimes if it's a product declaration from a business to business perspective, the producer does not really know what the intended use of the material could be, and at such times they may tend to use a declared unit. So for example, a lot of our construction materials are right now using declared units, because at the business to business level, for example, if I'm again going back to the example of being a construction materials producer, if I'm making a cubic yard of concrete that could be used in many different for many different functions, right? And I don't know what function you, the business that I'm selling to, is going to use it, but I can tell you what the impacts are going to be for that 1 cubic yard, and then you can use that as fit. So in that case, that's a declared unit. So it's a declared unit that is not necessarily reflecting the full functionality of the use scenario in which the material is going, right? So the EPD will typically also give you the limitations of the underlying life cycle assessment. Sometimes we don't account for certain components of the life cycle, not because we don't want to or because we don't think they're important, but because we may not have the appropriate data, and that becomes a limitation of the study, right? And then it also points out and lays out scenarios in where the EPDs can be used as comparable assertions. Now, the other aspect of the EPD also is that it declares the process that was used. So who was the third-party reviewer? It's a very open review process. What were the reviews and how were the reviews responded to? And of course, for each of these EPDs, there are also program operators, and there's all sorts of protocols around how long an EPD is valid and so on and so forth. So I will hit on some of this information again later on in the presentation. What it does not reveal is operational or compositional details. So for example, if you're buying a ton of asphalt mixture, short ton of asphalt mixture, it doesn't tell you, it could tell you give you the environmental impact, potential environmental impacts of that particular short ton of asphalt, but it probably will not tell you what the mixture composition is, or the mix design is. Example of an EPD, if you've been following me so far, EPDs in a very simple way of communicating what is an EPD is, it's very similar to a nutritional label, right? It just the way you have it when you buy your yogurt at the grocery store, you turn it around and you look at the little nutritional label that tells you how much sugar is the content there is and how many servings do you have. It's a very similar idea. So what we're doing is we're creating a nutritional label for environmental impacts of a particular material within a business to business, which is a cradle to gate scope. And that's kind of where much of the industry is right now in terms of the EPDs that we're producing. And this is an example of an asphalt mixture EPD from the Emerald Ecolabel program. And in this case, of course, you're seeing, and I know this is kind of a little tiny to read, but really I don't need you to read the details. I just need you to recognize that this is typically a 3 to 4 page document, which gives you information about what the life cycle stages are, what the environmental impacts are, and then list them out in these tables out here, which then helps you look at the metrics and make sense of it depending on what kind of context you're using it for decision making. Okay. So now that we've gotten a little bit of an introduction to life cycle assessment and PCRs and EPDs, I want to talk a little bit about, well, where does this all fit into the business and design and construction of pavements, right? And so how is this helping us move more towards a world where we can use life cycle thinking in our decision making, right? Which brings me to what, this is actually one of my favorite slides, and if you've heard presentations from me before, I like to use the slide because it really tells us how far we've come in the last number of years. So so a little bit of history of where we are today and how we got here. So about in 2010, the University of California Pavement Research Consortium, they started a working group of stakeholders. Dr. John Harvey was one of the leaders, main leaders who started this whole process. And part of it was because at that time, as academics, we were punching out papers looking at life cycle assessment of asphalt versus concrete, steel versus wood, left, right, and center, and without the advantage of product category rules, without the advantage of common system boundaries. And so we often ended up having papers that had results that were contradicting each other. And this was, of course, not very useful, particularly from an application perspective, because, well, what do? If you can show two papers in peer-reviewed journals where each is contradicting the other, neither of them are incorrect. It's just that they use different system boundaries. So it definitely needed or set the stage for a conversation of getting people together, getting stakeholders together, right? And so this led to, in 2011, the starting of, well, but the next thing that happened was the starting of the Federal Highways Sustainable Pavement Technical Working Group. And this effort has been going on for about 10 years now. And over the last 10 years, there's been various publications on developing the, understanding all the different considerations that go into a pavement lifecycle assessment, working with all the stakeholders, the different industries, and then establishing, well, what are the system boundaries? What are the functional units? So when I said the functional unit we use for pavements is a lane mile, well, that was argued over for quite a few meetings, right? Same thing when we look at when we look at what our system boundaries are, those were argued over too. But there has been a movement towards a consensus-driven model. And this is very important, because at the end of the day, if we can't agree on the system boundaries, then we can't really agree on the outcomes of these life cycle assessment studies, right? In the meantime, in 2013, the concrete industry came up with their product category rules, right? And then also in 2015, the Sustainable Pavements Guidelines and Framework document were published, and these are available on the Federal Highways website, and there's a lot of very valuable information in there, right? And of course, these documents look at the entire life cycle of the pavement, not just the cradle to gate, even though that's where we are with our EPDs. The FHWA documents look at the use stages as well, and there's been a fair amount of work done in the use stages. A lot of these models looking at, for example, how roughness or pavement deflection impacts the emissions during the use stage. These models are there, and they're not being used at this point within the realm of EPDs, but they are there for consideration and for decision-making support. In 2016, the product category rule for the asphalt mixtures industry was developed. And then finally, version 4 lead came out in 2016 as well. And so you're seeing how literally in the last 10 years, we've gone from what is LCA to industries adopting it, Federal Highways coming up with a set of best practices, and then finally, really having at the table all the different stakeholders, state agencies, DOTs, city municipalities. We've had city municipalities at the table. Cities sometimes tend to be at the cutting edge of some of these policies. Industry, of course.
Amlan, are you still there?
To give me a pavement that functions, delivers, a higher level of service for a longer life and has a lower environmental impact. That's great. So if you can construct something and have lower maintenance cycles on it, well, that's great. So what kind of materials are those, and how do we measure them? So really, in a sense, what we're doing is, through all this life cycle assessment work, what we're essentially providing is a measuring tape. So, and if we all have the same measuring tape, then we can start arguing about what is and what is not a better design. Same thing, this also leads us into innovative project delivery methods. Well, if we were to be using design, build, operate, maintain, or more the design, build family of project delivery methods, these metrics, this measuring tape becomes very useful in justifying one method over another, in suggesting that, oh, here is where a contractor could have an incentive for using greener materials, because the contractor also sees a long-term reduction in their maintenance costs. And again, that ties directly into environmental impacts, right? So if we have expectations of contractors, we want to incentivize contractors to use environmentally friendly materials, environmentally friendly construction processes. Well, then what is the measuring tape that we use? And EPDs are, again, a useful measure. Life cycle assessment-based methods generally, but EPDs specifically, become useful metrics to do that. And of course, as we move on through looking at not just, there is the world of building information models happening, more life cycle-based asset management happening, and all of this information becomes yet another piece within that data structure, right? And of course, all of this then leads to another world, and I don't do much work in this world, but really understand the behavior of occupants to reduce impacts, right? So if you know how, what kind of building energy usage or what kind of building usage leads to efficient energy use, and all of that ties down to, well, now we have a measuring tape. We know what the life cycle impact of this particular design or this particular material is going to be. Well, we can tie that into different kinds of usage scenarios and really look at a more life cycle based decision making platform. Within the world of pavements, what have we done? Well, this is a pyramid we like to talk about. Right at the bottom, we have the life cycle assessment framework environment. This is the Federal Highways document that was used. We've been moving up this pyramid, right? And so some of my research work has been working on the databases, which is the organized database and validation and the data, which sits right on top of the fundamentals, which has been already completed through the Federal Highways work, looking at the underlying system boundaries and the functional units required for pavement lifecycle assessment. And when I say data, what am I talking about? Well, if you're looking at this accounting method, we need data from many different materials, look at their life cycle production data, as well as the transportation. How far are they coming? How far are they traveling? Where are they coming from? How much energy was used in the process of manufacturing them? And so the next thing you know, you're drowning in large databases. And so apparently this is something I really enjoy doing. So a lot of my work in the last few years has been understanding the validity of these data sets and making sure that we can put together particularly upstream data sets that are common to all construction materials, for example, electricity, as well as like the impacts from electricity production, delivery, usage, and then the same thing for fossil fuels. We need fossil fuels pretty much for all products and processes. Well, where are our crudes coming from? Where is that data coming from? And as it turns out, the federal government, the different federal agencies actually curate this data, and so we've been working with the federal LCA Commons group to actually put together these, and we're just in the process of delivering this to Federal Highways, a set of common databases that we can use or that can become part of the PCR development process, so that when we're looking at a concrete mixture EPD and we're looking at an asphalt mixture EPD, or even different asphalt mixture EPDs or different concrete mixture EPDs, we know that at their base there are common upstream data sets that have been appropriately reviewed, quality controlled, and have also been appropriately regionalized, right? Because the electricity mix in Minnesota is different from the electricity mix in Michigan, and depending on where your material is coming from, that may make a difference. So this is kind of where we are, and EPDs are, even as they're getting into practice, there is a fair amount of science that is happening behind and is evolving, while at the same time, we are making progress in involving or using EPDs as an instrument in procurement, green procurement, and potentially best value procurement practices. Rating systems, Green Roads, Envision, LEED, Green Globes, they all are using some version of EPDs, encouraging, incentivizing, and ultimately they're providing baselines for quantitative support. So the next question is, well, state agencies, what are state agencies doing about it, right? And so I like to say, use this paraphrasing Albert Einstein, is that all things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I think this is where EPD, this is where the discussion is going next, is that while we have LCAs and EPDs, and at the end of the day, if you think about the concept, it's fairly complicated and there's many different moving parts. However, once we get an EPD on our hands, it looks like a very simple instrument that we can start comparing with. And well, we can start including it into our decision-making process. And this is where the part, but no simpler, comes in. Because we have to be a little careful, given the complexity that goes into creating these documents. So the question is, how do we use these instruments, and how do we use them responsibly, right? So that we're actually creating an environment for procurement that will help us make better decisions, rather than lead to more conflict in the industry. So this brings us to the proposed roadmap that we developed for Minnesota DOT last year, and the question that drove this work was, well, if Minnesota DOT were to look into using EPDs in their procurement processes, what would it look like? What would the different approaches be, and what are really the different factors that are driving a movement towards this adoption? And so what we did was, we, again, falling back on the consensus-driven model, we worked with the different stakeholders that Minnesota DOT identified for us. I know Kurt Turgeon is somewhere on this call. I heard his voice earlier, and it's always fun working with Kurt. And the first set of stakeholders were internal stakeholders. These are people at the DOT. And so we did multiple listening sessions into, like, what are your barriers, obstacles? What do you think would get in the way of doing this? How do you think this could be an advantage? So pros and cons, all of that. And then after that, we went out and also worked with the industries in Minnesota: asphalt, concrete, aggregate, steel. A whole bunch of them were there, and we had a really good conversation. And interestingly, the industries are in more ways than more prepared than we actually expect them to be, and then that's wonderful. And so, and this, of course, also reflects from my roadmap the amount of progress that has happened in this field in the last 10 years. So, market drivers. State agencies requiring EPDs during procurement. We know California is, well, there are other state agencies that are looking at it, Minnesota being one. And the question then is, well, what would be the nature of using EPDs in decision? Should they be for decision making already, or should we start off by benchmarking? Like, for example, if you need to, you can have what we're providing is a measuring tape. But even when you have a measuring tape, you still need that initial benchmark. And maybe the first step is just benchmarking, right? With the market driver, we also need a facilitator, right? So, so industries have the capability of creating EPDs. There are programs, there are EPD programs out there. There are compliant PCRs. Well, that's great. So the question is how to make sure that the EPDs are available to contractors, easy to use, low cost, right? And then at the same time, and again, yeah, I want to highlight easy to use and low cost because we can't expect contractors to get into the nitty-gritty and the details of lifecycle assessment, and really we don't want them to. So it should be probably electronic delivery, some way by which you can easily, but at the same time, and that brings me to the third component, reliably be able to communicate this information, right? And so all of this goes into, like, all of these factors: having the right market drivers, having the right facilitators, a combination of industry and agency, the ability to get easy to use, low cost EPDs, using them in decision making context appropriately with the appropriate benchmarks, and then making sure that what we're getting out there is reliable information, right? Addressing and accounting for uncertainty, and where possible stating our imperfections appropriately would be very useful, because again, as I said, some of the science is still evolving, and saying that something is imperfect is not a bad thing, because it tells us that this needs further work. And so it's movement towards perfection. But all of this ties into that effective integration into design and procurement. So along those lines, we looked at, as I mentioned, that there are really the organizational and the technological aspects. So we essentially identified these different boxes and for a roadmap. Like, here are the boxes. How are they? Where are we right now in each of these boxes? I'm sorry, I'm an engineer. I tend to think in boxes, but how do they relate to each other, and what do we have in them? So if you just quickly go through them, the drivers, for example, right? So for Minnesota, the driver, one of the drivers for this work and moving forward would be the bill. I think that's the number HF 2203 and HF 2204. These are very similar to the California bill. And then also this is all being driven by your governor's executive order 1712. And all of this ultimately is that, well, the question was, should Minnesota be adopting a legislative environment the same as California, or can you still be go through and deliver on your governor's executive order without creating a legislative environment, but having more an innovation-based, incentivized environment, right? And so that was one of the. So given these drivers, what are the best ways to answer these questions, right? Resources and references. The good news is that the industries already have their EPD programs in place. So it isn't as if we're working in an environment of, in a knowledge poor environment or a practice poor environment, because the asphalt industry, the concrete industry, aggregate industry, they have their EPD programs in place. And so if you're a contractor looking for an EPD right now, you can quite affordably develop an EPD for your mixtures and for your products. Now, and same thing with the knowledge. We are not in a knowledge poor environment. As I mentioned earlier, the Federal Highways Pavement Lifecycle Assessment Framework has provided us a very useful foundation to work with. And of course, there is also a significant amount of standardization that is helping us with, creating reliable PCRs and as well as EPDs. So we've got the ISO and not that any of us are going to remember these numbers, but 14025, 21930, 15804, all these different the compliance regimes. And then there is also a fair amount of peer experiences, because Caltrans has been working on it because, well, they had to respond to their legislative requirements. And so there's been a lot of work happening at the University of California Pavement Research Consortium, as well as within Caltrans. Washington State has had a similar study looking at what they can and cannot do given their they had a similar bill in their state legislature. Oregon DQ has been looking at incentivizing contractors. So there are other peer experiences out there that we can build on, right? So we're not working completely in a vacuum. Technical questions, and this is kind of where this is some of the questions, like what are the system boundaries to be used? What are our data requirements? Do we have the appropriate metadata, level of upstream details? Customization, prioritization, how much uncertainty. I have a PhD student who's working on uncertainty right now, and he's almost ready to graduate. But each of these, there is a little PhD or 2 or 3 sitting in there. And so, but again, there is also a pretty strong academic community that is involved in this research and in this and this work, and then also ensuring that some of this work, the research that we're doing, is getting reflected back into practice and working with our industry partners. So some of this is happening right now, and as I mentioned, I spoke briefly about my research a little earlier, but there are various other research efforts, most notably are coming out of Dr. John Harvey's group, where they're developing a tool for pavement lifecycle assessment that can be very easily used by DOTs. I think they've already had a couple of trial runs on that, and our work is backing that tool up with providing the appropriate data sets that can be used. This is, I think, in some ways, a very important and also very difficult area. Is like, what are the organizational questions? How do we take all the science behind it, the advantages we have with the resources, how do we tie that into smooth data management and process flows, right? How do we make sure that we're not overburdening current business processes, but rather integrating them into the current business processes, but also taking advantage of some of the current business processes, right? There are some questions like, well, if we were going to create a, and so these are some of these questions are mundane but extremely important. Like, well, if you're going to create a baseline, we have to collect EPDs. Well, who's going to be collecting EPDs? Who's going to have that authority? Where is the administrative infrastructure going to be? Where is the database going to be? But once we have that, we can actually create the baseline. And once we do the baseline, well, can we use it for best value procurement? Can we use it for incentivizing contractors? But at the same time, the flip side of this, or the other side of this coin, of course, is that there's always a significant need for education and outreach and integrating these best practices. And then finally comes, if you tie all of that in together, the technical knowledge that is there, the resources, the organizational questions, well, how do we go about implementing it? What would that pilot use look like, right? What if we were to use EPDs for procurement, how would that tie into the Code of Federal Regulations with respect to data verification requirements as well as transparency? What would disclosure rules look like? You know, how would we evaluate the benefits to contractors? Because we really, at the end of the day, want this to create a new environment for innovation, right? Not something that's just going to be another burden, but really help innovate. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the broader picture of lifecycle thinking, really help us get to better designs and better performance on our assets, right? Well, how do we do this? So this box right here is our next challenge, is what we are looking to do next, and hopefully we will be working with within the context of different states and hopefully Minnesota to further pursue these questions and actually get our hands dirty into jumping in and doing some of it. My current Federal Highways project has a requirement for a case study with the state, and I will be working with Kurt because he volunteered Minnesota. So I will be working with Kurt to look at some of these questions within the context of Minnesota DOT. So going back to, well, I said procurement is driving all this stuff. What did the bill say? So it requires submission of EPDs by successful bidders for a set of eligible materials. And of course, right now, if you look at it, the eligible materials does not include concrete and asphalt. And so why did that happen? That even though concrete and asphalt actually had PCRs and successful EPD programs in place, I think, and again, this is a personal opinion, but the nature in which the bill was written left a lot of questions about how the EPDs were going to be used in decision making, and I think that to some extent led to certain materials being getting themselves excluded. But it's pretty. I mean, the writing is on the wall that in future these materials, the list of materials will be extended to include both concrete and asphalt. And then moving forward, the question is, how do we, when bills like this are written and then go on to become a legislation, how do we ensure that we keep it simple, but not simpler, you know? Because again, the reality is that when we say we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and let's use EPDs, that makes perfect sense. Excepting once you understand the different complexities in getting all the data in there and coming up with a reliable number that can be, or well, that it's never just a number, it's usually an interval, coming up with something that's reliable, that actually expresses meaningful information, that sentence suddenly begins to unravel, and there is, and we have to start writing in more more detail into some of these sentences. And so which then of course brings the bigger picture is like, well, how do we actually use all this information work in a meaningful way within the procurement process? This slide should have probably come earlier, and but again, I said there are plenty of different standards, and we're functioning within these different standard regimes. More importantly, as we are doing that, there is another community that is kind of developing around this. It's like, well, who watches the watchers, right? So we have reviewers for LCAs, we have reviewers for PCRs, we have reviewers for developing these benchmarks. Well, where is that community, right? So my co-PI on this, Liana Miller, she's an LCA CP, which is a Lifecycle Assessment Certified Professional, which is a certificate that is given through ACLCA. And so, again, this is a very interdisciplinary field. You know, I'm an engineer, and I've been working in lifecycle assessment for over 12, 13 years now, and I've conducted LCAs But at the same time, when I was going to school or when I was getting my degrees, we'd never heard of life cycle assessment, right? So this is a growing body of knowledge. And again, as an engineer working in civil engineering, I'm having to deal with the product upstream impacts of different additives which come from the chemical engineering world. And honestly, my chemistry needs a little brushing up. It never was that good. So we're working in a very, very interdisciplinary world. And so there is definitely a bigger need of really educating students, bringing in professionals, and even mid to late career professionals, and identifying ways to update our own skills so that we can function in this more effectively. The European Union has, well, they're a little bit more, their organization is different. They're more legislation based, they're more centralized, but they've been having, they're moving towards more what they call product environmental footprints, which is tying together all the different components and really centralizing the PCR process. I'm not going to, I think we're running out of time here, so I'm going to, I think I've pretty much touched on most of this. I'm going to leave this, complete this discussion with this diagram, which tells you where all the different PCRs are right now and what the different statuses are. PCRs are valid for 5 years, and so they have to be updated every 5 years, which is really useful because it helps reflect some of the innovation that's happened in the industry and basically update and make sure the protocols are not set in stone and not fossilized, but really updated from time to time. And so with that, I think I'll open this up for discussion and any questions that people would have.
Thank you, Amlan. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if you have one, you can also go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask the question as well.
So Amlan, this is Kurt. How are things going in California with their mandate and their putting together data? Or do you know?
Well, you know, thanks to the pandemic, a lot of our conversations have been muted a little bit, but I cannot give you the most recent answer. But as of TRB, I believe they're in the process of implementing their first round. What they were supposed to this summer, so I don't know the most recent details because, as I said, we haven't been having a lot of 1v1 conversations. But as of TRB, which is January of 2020, I believe they were in the process of developing a system in terms of putting in the benchmarking process, as well as the LCAP process, which is the California's version of pavement lifecycle assessment, and integrating that into their asset management system. And those were all efforts that were ongoing.
Hey, Amlan, this is Tom Raven. I'm from the construction office. Couple questions for you. Number one, I'm just curious, how fast is this moving? And then I noticed that you know, you're talking about best value selection. I have to tell you that scares the hell out of me, because you know all the challenges we get, and you're trying to create standards for all these things, and are they really equal? And I just see all kinds of challenges with something like that. And I'll let you answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's kind of interesting because that. So we just finished putting together the co-authoring. Steve Minch and Giovanni Magliaccio at University of Washington were my co-authors. The NCHRP Sustainable Highway Construction Practices guideline, and I think and part of that, we looked at different existing standards, and you know, best value procurement exists already, and so you're right. It's not. You know, if you look at the P plus Q in the whole BVP process, what we were suggesting is that given these benchmarks, best value procurement provides you an existing business process that you can take advantage of to introduce EPDs. So you're not really looking at coming up with a whole different procurement process, but really taking advantage of what really exists. So best value procurement, and you're right, this is by no means, we're far from a point where we can say, oh well, let's just go and put it in there. But at the same time, you can incentivize like LEED does, you can incentivize a contractor and say, well, if you provide EPDs on this, or if, over a period of time, if this could lead to specific construction-based incentives. So yes, I'm not giving you a very good answer other than saying BBP has the framework that would allow you to integrate some of this information in. How we would integrate that would be part of one of the implementation questions we'd look at. And in fact, because we're doing the case study with Kurt, this might actually be a very interesting question to delve into deeper and say how. Okay, I can. I'm not used to.
Started by NAPA and scheduled to be completed in January 22.
The asphalt PCR is valid till January 22, and the asphalt PCR revision process just started a couple of weeks ago. So the new asphalt PCR, if all goes well, should be active and available starting 1st of February 2022. But the current PCR is in place and valid till 2022.
And this is Richard Steger.
Yeah.
Just to follow up to that question, and maybe it's in your presentation somewhere and I missed it, but are there links to these sites like at ASTM or NAPA for where these things are located?
Yeah, absolutely. And after the presentation, I have another meeting right after this, but I would be happy to send out this presentation as well as some of the links to this to Lauren, and maybe she can share it with the attendees.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Well, we are at 11 o'clock. If anyone has any other questions, you can share them now. I apologize. I got disconnected a couple of times during the presentation, but all right. Well, thank you very much, Amlan.
My pleasure.
And I will go ahead and post the presentation to the Research Pays Off page under the July recording once I get that up as well. So you can find that there, and I can go ahead and send a link to that for those of you who might need it.
Yeah.
So you can find all that information there at the link that I just shared in the chat box. And we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.